Okay, hi everyone. We are continuing a design review for our question function framework. Right, so names of question. Okay, we're talking about question interface. All right, help me out with where we should start here.
Start with the doc page.
Okay.
And that line of code you could open up as well. Those are just some samples for what the individual doc pages for the question interface types might look like.
Okay. All right, so explain to me how I run this. I mean, so in other words, if I say I'm trying to make a quiz, and where does this exactly fit in? Is that what I'm about to see in this thing here?
No. So far, it only fits inside of a question object. These don't really do anything standalone.
Okay. Do they just sit there on? I mean,
they just sit there in.
Okay, that's not necessarily
unevaluated form, right?
Okay, so what should I look at here?
So this is like the content of the documentation. We need a new doc type page that Brian Van Vertler is going to set up. And this is sort of the sketch of the content that's going to fill those pages.
Okay, but just show me a basic example here. Is this the basic example?
Yeah, that's the basic example, right?
Okay, so remind me what the difference is between a question object and a question interface.
The question object has assessment in it. Can have assessment.
And what makes it a question interface as opposed to just a general interface?
Right. So that was the question that you posed last time. And we took that to some of interested people to see if they thought we should generalize this to make something like a multiple choice interface object that lives outside of the question world. Mm-hmm. And they said that didn't really make sense and that we should just make it live in the question.
Explain why. I mean, what does this question interface do? This question interface basically defines an interface, which could, to me, I don't understand why it can't be in a manipulate, for example.
Well, what Lou said is that if there's a control type that's missing, that we should add the control type, basically.
Is Lou here? If not, could we find him?
No, he's not, but I could find him.
Okay. Okay, so I don't understand. I mean, I just don't get.
I mean, the main added benefits to this over the underlying controller are closely tied to the fact that it is a question object with assessment.
Okay, why? Why? Explain why. I mean,
in other words, one of the main things is like marking up correct and incorrect answers, adding.
So that's in the question interface. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
So that will be part of the payload here of the question interface, but you're not showing that here.
Right.
You're not showing that in this case.
We're not showing that in these simple examples, and it's not implemented in most cases yet.
Right. Okay. So here, I see. So this would automatically surface a question interface given the assessment function.
Exactly. Right. Everything you need to know is inferred from the assessment function. You could give the things explicitly and overwrite it, but you don't need to.
Well, okay, fair enough. I'm warming to the idea that this is a separate kind of thing. Although I think it'll be frustrating to people if there's something which you can get, it's like the people using dataset just because it does formatting type thing, right?
Right.
It's
that's a possibility here. And then the only problem is that the term question might be slightly a misnomer.
No, I know. So that's my point.
Right.
But why is it okay?
But you could do it with just a controller, right? I mean, for most of these things, you could get the same thing with just a controller.
Well, except the syntax is different.
Right.
Syntax is completely different.
Syntax is different.
Right, which is not good. So, I mean, in this case, what does this do here? This has no assessment, right? So it doesn't have a submit button. So what is this? This is a disembodied interface.
Right. You could use this in like a survey, right? But it's.
Can you use it in a survey? I mean, what about, okay, so in a form, I see, in a form notebook, you could have something just like this. Is that correct?
That's right. In the Q&A form, or potentially even in a
Okay,
standard
which you
form
could then
notebook.
harvest, correct?
And then and then it would be harvested with the data for the form notebook. Yes.
How? How is that, and how does that relate to the dynamic mechanism that exists in current interfaces?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, I mean, when you do this with a multiple choice.
Let me answer the first half of your question before you dive into the second half.
Okay.
All right. So in a standard form notebook, if you put in a question object, it would, the user's value that is sitting there would show up in the data that you do whatever to add to a data bin, send an email, whatever. In a Q&A form notebook, it would be, it would go through the assessment routine, which would kind of has built-in storage. And yeah, it wouldn't actually be marked right or wrong, but sort of it would use one of the standard storing mechanisms.
Okay. Lou.
Hello.
Is Lou here?
Yes.
Hi there. Okay. So my question is, right now with interfaces, we are using the whole dynamic mechanism. We take, I mean, what will be the analog of this as a existing interface mechanism? Is this radio button? What is this?
Well, what we're looking at right now is a radio button bar. It's a select one from many control. And we have lots of select one from many controls. We have radio button bar. Yeah.
Okay, so how would I actually get this exact thing with the radio button bar?
You would, the first argument is a dynamic reference to the variable storing the value. And then the second argument is the set of choices. So list, string red, comma, string, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and what if I want to say pick a color?
Well, then we have things like column and panel and things that let you build up,
Okay, so let's say panel, column, Okay. So what's happening here is if I say dynamic of arg here, I get that. That's my means of communication here. In this case, my means of communication is there isn't a means of. Now, in this case, is there a one argument form of radio button bar that doesn't have a dynamic variable? There is for slider, right?
There is a zero argument form for slider. Yes. And I guess there's a one argument form as well, where you can give a real. But no, radio button bar requires attaching to a dynamic variable.
Oh, slider dynamic of X would be ambiguous if there was a one argument form.
It's not ambiguous because it has head dynamic, which is
I see
distinguishable.
Okay. So our mechanism right now is, and one of the things that's interesting, we invented dynamics long before all of these, React-like interfaces existed, but I think they work in a somewhat similar way. Is that a true statement? Anybody comment on that?
I'm not sure what you mean by React-style interfaces.
Well, like the React JavaScript framework. It has a way of dealing with, dynamic content that I think is in the end, this reactive, I don't know, I haven't followed.
Our dynamic mechanism is based entirely on symbol values.
I know how our dynamic mechanism works.
I don't think
I know how it works. I'm asking in the 25 years since we invented it, right? Or whatever it is. How long is it now? It's it was version 6, right? So it's about nearly 20 years since we invented this. There are different ideas in the world about interfaces, which include ones which I think are somewhat similar, although maybe not as fancy as the ideas that we have about this. But what we're basically bringing in here is this dynamic mechanism isn't what we're using here, right? So for a form notebook, we have a different concept. Instead of storing state in dynamic variables, which are kind of hidden state relative to the controls. What we're doing is the controls are the story, and we are then harvesting the control values, right? Which is similar to the setting mechanism that we have, right?
Right.
Mhm.
Have we
So-
hooked that up to work at all, Sylvia or Schroeder? on
No,
these?
there's not setting for question objects.
Okay.
Okay, but so just so I understand, if I say, I don't even know how do I use this again? I can say, this would be, okay, so here I would say, I could do that, and now I can move this around, and then I can get a value. So that's a very similar concept. So setting is the pull the value from the outside version for our dynamic controls. Now, how would I do that for a radio button bar? Like, since I don't want a dynamic variable there. Lou.
Well, you can have a radio button bar that's based on a non-dynamic variable. So you say red as the first argument, or one of the.
Why do I have to do that? I mean, why do I have to do that? And so that's my
That's the
initial value.
documented syntax.
Okay. All right. But I mean, but then the analog here is, what is the analog here? When I first bring this up, okay, nothing is selected, which means that actually isn't, okay, so that's a different form of radio button bar that has nothing selected, so to speak.
Right. If you copy that output 9 into setting, it works.
I mean,
Okay,
radio
difference,
button bar, as far as an initial value, radio button bar is no different from slider. You can't have a slider without a value. You can't have a radio button bar without a value, a pop-up menu without a value.
Okay. Well, so, okay, so by the way, why did that produce quotes when I just Command Shift whatever?
Because input style has show string characters set to true.
So if I unpaneled it, would it still be like that or not?
I think panel turns that off. If not, there's an option for turning it off. I think panel
Okay.
sets that option though.
Magnificent. Okay, so this is now the metaphor. This
But
is our
does
purely
setting go through the panel? Setting probably doesn't go through the panel. Oh, interesting panel.
Weird.
flip.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yes, setting is rodentifies, but it doesn't remove non-dynamic stuff.
Right. That's clever, actually. I like it.
okay. Okay, so let me just understand then. So what you're proposing here is something which is, you're proposing a new world of controls, basically.
A layer on top of controls.
Well, it's a different design.
Right. But you could imagine in one of the things in the association and question interface being control, just like in form object, where you could say control goes to radio button bar or
Yes.
checkbox bar or slider, right? That's not going to be in 13.0, but it's something we want to do.
All right.
So when I was thinking about these question things, I mean, one question I had was, will it make sense to have them accessible in manipulate or in form
Exactly,
object?
that's my
Does that
question.
even make any sense? And if it does, then we need to have the communication happening via some dynamic variable somewhere.
Well, okay, so what would it look like? I mean, right now, this is a pull from the outside object, like setting, right? Rather than a dynamic variable thing. Boy, okay. Okay, so the issue is, in an interface, how do you, okay, so there are two possibilities. Either you know its state because it's setting a dynamic variable, or you pull its state out, right? Those are the two cases. Now, for example, this thing here is a less than magnificent pulling the state out. Right, as in what one could imagine is something built from ordinary controls where one wants to essentially harvest the state. One could make something, go ahead.
We have a construct dynamic setting, which I don't know if you recall, but it is the thing that wraps an invisible setting around an expression. So that if that expression were used as input, it would do the harvesting automatically.
Okay.
So if you take your in9, for instance, and wrap it in dynamic setting of panel of that, that produces an output, which when interpreted as input, does the setting thing. No evaluating place. I mean, so here we have an output. Now, evaluating that output does the setting. So it doesn't evaluate to something with head radio button bar. It evaluates to
beeped. Oh no, there we go.
Green, right.
Okay.
I don't know if this is
relevant
or not.
Either. I don't know either. Okay, let's come back again.
But it's an example of automatic harvesting, I guess.
Yes. Well, which this is not doing. This is not doing automatic harvesting. This is doing sit there and just kind of idle until a harvester comes in and harvests you. Right? That's what that's doing. That's not self-harvesting in any way. Am I wrong, guys? Right? That's
right.
Okay. Right. We could certainly hook up setting to work on question object.
Okay.
I think that makes sense.
On question object. So I see. So question, that would extract whatever the thing was. Okay.
If you're using it out of a form notebook.
Okay, but in a manipulate, the way that you communicate the value of a variable, the way that you communicate a dynamic thing is through the value of a variable. And that's the only mechanism we have for doing that. So here, the question would be, if this is the control, so this would be the analog, this question object thing would be the analog of a control in a manipulate, would it not? Right, because the manipulate, when it's eventually doing its thing, like let's say I say manipulate, and then I've got to have a payload here. Let's say I say, list xxx, comma, x, comma, list red, green, blue.
Right.
Okay, so now it will do this. So what makes sense here is it's this thing here, this kind of destination for X, that's where we will put the question object. Is that not correct? Just like I could say in there, I could say here, if I'm not mistaken, I could say slider there. Is that right? No, what the heck did that do? How do I make
I think you want that to be a function. So slider of hash hash.
Why do I need hash hash?
Well, hash for the first, hash 1 is dynamic of X and hash 2 is the default.
What happens if I just do this?
Well, then you'll get a slider that doesn't have a dynamic binding. No, not hash comma hash.
Oh, hash hash.
Slot sequence. Yeah.
It doesn't seem to work.
It did work, but it doesn't have the right initial value. It doesn't have any initial value, so it guessed.
I see. So why is this different from just saying slider? Is that just some kind of?
It's not. It's syntactic sugar that lets you do arbitrary. I mean, the benefit in the function notation is not to summon built-in controls, but to build your own controls.
Right. Okay.
We have a convenient syntax. We have control type that can be set as an option if you want to change.
So let's go look at this in more. I mean, just for people on the live stream are asking, why is this useful and intuitive? It's beautiful. It's magnificent, but it's not for this purpose, so to speak. I mean, this is very intuitive. This is very nice because But the issue is, what if we, okay, so let's understand what if we wanted to pick, what if we wanted to use this question interface thing? A question object wraps assessment functions around, which is irrelevant, right? What if we just want to use a question interface as the way to set values for A? That's basically what we have in mind here, correct?
That's sounds like what you have in mind.
Right. So, I mean, syntactically, we could imagine manipulate taking an association in that argument position. Lou?
That would be unambiguous since we don't support associations there yet.
Right. But I mean, so in other words, then what we would be doing is taking whatever a question object could do, whatever a question interface does, and a question interface returns something. I mean, a question interface has a value, correct? What does the unset question interface do?
Nothing right now.
Well, so this one here. So if I were to say, what
That's
is
the question
value?
object.
Okay, no, I know. I mean, even the question object thing. If I had, how do I even get back to the initial state? And actually, Peter on the live stream is commenting that it's a bad idea to have a radio button, which is a kind of a one-way street. Where how do I get back to the initial state here? Hello.
I don't know. I don't think you can. How do you unselect a radio? Can you do that in radio button bar?
Of course you can, because the radio button.
How do you do it in radio button?
I don't think
you have a radio
can.
button bar in the middle of your notebook right now.
I know
Think about
that,
it.
but think about it.
How do
What
you
I've
get back
done there is no, because I had to give.
What if you made that something that's not one of the values? Make it
Okay.
X. Then select one. How do you get back?
You can't.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Fair
It's
enough.
the same
The
story.
same way you can't slide a slider to a number that's not in the range.
Yeah. All right. Fair enough. Okay. Okay.
And
Right.
if we thought that was an important feature, one of the things that having question object question interface allows for us to do is to have like a clear button somewhere in the panel.
Yeah, but look, if you're
This
doing
is a higher
test,
level construct.
or you're, I mean, okay, if there is no none of the above for some survey, then there is no none of the above. You've got to pick.
Right.
Am
right.
I
If there is
a
none of the
frog or a
above,
toad or
presumably,
something?
yeah. Right. Yep.
Totov on a live stream is saying you could always unclick, you could click a second time on this. That's not how our interface currently works. It could be, but it's not.
I mean, you could certainly imagine like a thing where you're clicking points in a 2D array and you want to clear them all and, get back to some.
Right. I
initial
think it's a
state.
separate thing. That's a thing for Lou, for the way that radio button bar works.
Yeah, and locator pane allows removing thumbs with
Indeed.
Modifier clicks. So maybe we
Right,
can-
right.
Yeah,
like-
modifier click would be a reasonable way to start here.
Right. But you could imagine maybe there's an initial state where there's some data in there and you want to get back to it. Yeah. Yeah. Reset. There would be times where reset is a useful thing.
Okay. All right. So let's go back to the what we're talking about here. So to me, then, we are not. This is. I mean, it bothers me somewhat that we have two mechanisms here that basically end up with the same user interface. One based on dynamic variables, and one based on harvesting. And what would it look like if you wanted to harvest from this? You would say dynamic of, what would you do here? Lou,
Would
what
it make
you do?
it better if we got rid of the one argument form of question object and required assessment?
No, we don't want to do that. What would you do if I wanted to make a dynamic thing that was this, but where these things set a dynamic variable? How would I do that?
With a radio button bar.
No, I'm not asking that. I'm asking within question interface, how would I do that?
You wouldn't.
No, that's the wrong answer. Let's imagine that I'm using all kinds of fancy features of question interface not supported by other control types, but yet I want to provide this dynamic mechanism for those fancy features that are supported by question interface and not. Lou hasn't developed, the geolocator something or other thing as a generic control, but we do have it in question interface. I'm asking, how do I make a dynamic?
We should
question
not
interface?
create a question interface with a fancy control without creating the control independently.
Okay, I think that's nonsense. I mean, look, this is, I mean, what is, okay, so you're saying a drag and drop interface, the sort interface here. You're saying that we'd have to create a control for every one of these. Okay, if we're going to have a control,
we have to create the control anyway. We have to do the hard part. We might as well.
No, we don't have to do the hard part because the control, this is a pretty special purpose version of that control. Okay, you're signing Lou up for endless work, or Lou in general, the front end team in general, for endless work where we're saying somebody needs some weird, thing for doing, I don't know, crystallography, where they have some weird kind of control where they're, having people put dots of Miller indices or something on some weird projection of something or other. And then you say, oh, that should be a general control. But we might want to introduce that in our essentially question interface type repository without it being a general kind of control. Okay. So what I'm then asking is, if we do that, which I think we will want to do, if we do that, and some of those controls will make no sense generically as dynamic controls. Like these things that are picking, a radio button, these are, I mean, I guess you can use them as dynamic controls, but they are much more useful as harvested things. So I'm asking, what is the bridge between question interface and dynamic? Okay, Lou, how do you set, when you say dynamic, how do you say that the X is a dynamic variable set to the value of this thing? Do you understand what I'm asking? It's a very basic question.
So every control as its
I know, I'm not talking about controls. I'm saying you have this thing and I'm going to make a change here. This is the thing which exposes itself as a user interface, okay? But it is not a known pre-programmed control. Do you see what I'm saying?
So you want to bind you want to bind this to a dynamic variable somehow.
That's correct.
So, and your question is what the language design for that should be?
What is that? Do we already have that capability?
I mean, and I was going to mention that for controls, the language design is that the dynamic of a variable is, the first argument.
Part of the control.
Right.
Right, but it isn't in this case. So let's say.
What if inside the association we had control goes to, slider dynamic of X,
What are we doing? No.
Inside the question interface specification.
No. That's not solving the right problem. The problem that I'm asking for is assume that just like in this case here, where I have setting of this thing. So presumably this question object, if I were to do this, okay, let's imagine that I have something like this. I have this, and then I evaluate in place and I get this, okay? I think we all agree that this could harvest in place. Right? Okay, let's say instead that I want this, instead of harvesting in place, I want this to set a dynamic variable. How would I do that? Isn't there a way with dynamic or dynamic module? Couldn't I just set this as some kind of value in a dynamic module?
Well, it's implemented as a dynamic that's how module. It's implemented. Yeah. I mean, all you need to do is mention what global, so there's already a binding to some local variable. You want to bind it to some variable in the user space. I think that variable has to be mentioned somewhere in the input, possibly as a new element of this association.
No, but why? Why isn't there a thing that just says something like this, dynamic bind, X, control? Just like your dynamic setting just becomes dynamic setting is a little different.
I mean, it's the same thing.
Evaluation time thing.
It's the same story if you had a zero, like the zero argument slider. That thing comes out, there's no dynamic variable bound to it from the user's point of view.
Yes. So how would you do that?
after
would
the
you-
fact make a dynamic variable that's bound to
Right,
it?
that's what I'm asking. Right. What is the external wrapping
You-
for slider?
Right, I assume dynamic
can't.
at setting at slider does not work, right? As opposed to
Lou,
dynamic setting.
explain.
you can't artificially so if you have slider of no arguments,
Mhm.
there's nothing in that output that can advertise anything to any variable. This is a pure front end thing. It does not communicate with the kernel at all.
I understand that. So I'm asking,
So you
how do I
can't
make a
bind
wrapper?
this. You can't artificially bind this output to some other dynamic variable. If that's not what you're asking,
Why?
then
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. That's what I'm asking. Why can't I do that? Why is there no mechanism to do that?
because this is a pure front end object. There's no kernel involved in
Okay,
this
so the
output
point
at
is
all.
that the event that is generated as I move this, the front end knows it changed, but it doesn't. Okay, as it is configured here, it makes no, it does not broadcast anything to the kernel to say there was a change, right? Whereas if that had been slider of X, the dynamic of X, then that knows to broadcast to the kernel that there is a change. Is that correct?
Right, absolutely.
Okay, so what I'm saying is there's no reason why you can't put an outer wrapper here that says this thing is going to be a broadcast to the kernel thing, which, so the issue that you're bringing up is if I make this thing, I simply don't understand why this can't transform itself to something which has the same broadcast to the kernel feature that slider of dynamic of X.
I mean, I guess it depends on at what point are you. If you want to do this, in a separate output sometime in the future, I can't quite picture how that would be doable.
Okay,
If you're talking about doing it directly in an input, so dynamic bind of X comma slider could evaluate to, or even just typeset to slider of dynamic of X, that makes some sense.
No, you're not going to be able to use the first argument of slider to do this. Okay, that's the whole point. You're going to be given a control that is settable in the front end, just as these ones are. Okay. However, this one is settable in the front end, but it does not pre-contain the broadcast information. Now, possibly the internal code of this could be made to have something which is a hidden broadcasting that could be picked up on by a dynamic bind function on the outside. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's an efficiency hack because it isn't, in principle, conceptually, you could be doing polling harvesting of this thing. Do you get what I'm saying?
I
Yes.
think I do.
Right. Conceptually, dynamic bind could simply say, check every millisecond, what's the state of that control? If it's changed, then go broadcast something to the kernel. Now, that's obviously not what we want implementationally, but that's the conceptual thing. And that would allow us to unify something which is this question interface thing with, the current dynamic mechanism. Right? And similarly, in
how would the
question interface.
control? So in this syntax that you're proposing, there's an implicit, this control is somehow broadcasting a single value.
Good point.
How does
Well, how does that
know
work?
that?
Okay, so good question.
In
good question.
in question interface, a single value, well, even if that value happens to be like an array or something with structure, is implied.
Okay, so question interface is a single result object.
Right. It's the same
Yeah.
value that would be passed to the assessment function. That's what you're getting.
Right. So, okay, so that control has the feature that, okay, so here's the syntactic flow, so to speak, semantic flow. Setting of that control returns something. Dynamic bind, bad name, of X comma that control will dynamically assign the setting of control to X every time it needs to be assigned. Does that make sense, Lou?
I understand what you mean. Yes.
Does dynamic bind return a version of it where
Does
it's
the
bound?
exact same thing as dynamic does. It's the same as slider of dynamic of X. If I wrote dynamic bind here, if I wrote dynamic bind of this of X comma slider, that would be equivalent to slider of dynamic of X.
Right, but that returns that. Right. If you put in a slider object, it doesn't modify it in place. You know what I mean?
What do you mean? It did,
I think the output, the typeset output would be radically different between these two inputs.
Why? 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 I think it would be identical. All this is doing is, in the same obscure hidden way that this is dynamically binding X as the slider moves, so would this be.
It's doing it in a different, obscure, hidden way.
No, it's not. It's the idea is to be the same. This is,
Well,
every time the slider moves, change the value of X. Right?
yes.
Okay. That other thing is doing the exact same thing, isn't it?
It has the same effect, yes.
And why isn't it typeset the same?
Because you want to be able to pass things into dynamic bind that aren't strictly controls, that don't know how to deal with
No,
dynamic
that's
events.
an implementation issue. Remember what I said.
Well, that's what I'm
Well,
saying. It's implemented differently. The boxes would look, the box structure would be different for these two cases.
Oh, yeah. The box structure will be different.
That's
but the
the point I was
appearance on the
making.
screen would be identical.
Yes, I agree with that.
No problem with that. I agree with you. The box structure will be different. And, it could be the case. Okay, so implementationally, it might have to reach in and grab some hidden dynamically set variable. And question interface could conventionally, could do the transaction of providing such a thing. Am I making sense?
Yeah, there'd be some contract between question object and setting.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Right. But I mean, so I'm just trying to understand. I mean, this may not be a thing we implement instantly, but I'm trying to understand what is the relationship between these two worlds. And it seems like this is the relationship, that this thing is a way of generating an interface that just sits there, representing the setting that was given. Okay. Which could then be harvested using setting, submitted using its own submission mechanism, where that's completely different from what happens with slider of dynamic of X, where there is no submission mechanism. It is communicating via these dynamic variables.
Can I point out one other thing? So setting doesn't operate on boxes. Setting operates on expressions. So if one of these questions objects is, you've picked a color, you've chosen blue. Is that choice reflected in the expression? If you were to coerce that to an input, is the choice serialized into the input, or are there plans to do so?
Okay, so let's just
Schroeder,
take
do you have an
this.
answer to that?
Well, let's just take this and ask for the input form of that. Lawful.
Yeah, but green is there.
Oh, I see. Question framework private input green. Okay. So if I were to reevaluate this,
I don't claim that this is ideal. I'm just pointing out that the choice is there.
yeah, okay. So it does correctly serialize with its choice. So it is merely for setting, it has a fighting chance of being able to pull this out.
Right. Although
Right.
we may want to change how this
Yeah, we may want to give it a wrapper around here
Right.
so that so it's safe. So it isn't just setting like going in, into the jungle and pulling out, a butterfly that it happened to find flapping around that might not have been the correct butterfly.
Indeed.
Okay. All right. So I think given this, I'm sort of okay with this two-world mechanism because there's a bridge that we can build between them. Okay, so that then means that with question interface, we would be optimizing the let's see. We'd kind of be optimizing for things which people want to put in as questions, which is a little different, maybe, than what we optimize for controls, but we can always make a control out of this, which doesn't seem crazy. This seems okay. I think I'm convinced here.
So if one wanted to use a question object in manipulate, one could use this dynamic bind trick.
Yes.
Is that the
I mean,
workflow?
That's the workflow. I mean, you would do that under the hood, I think, but at least that's the concept.
Sure. Mhm.
So in other words, you would simply put a question interface right in there. You would say X list,
I get it.
X comma question interface, and it would just do the right thing.
And manipulate syntax has the variable, and yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. I think we have a plan there. Okay. Let's go back now to look at the question interface types. Choose multiple. See, what the heck is that?
That's what we want to review in this meeting that we have 9 minutes left for.
I went ahead and had another one set up for next week.
Okay. We needed to do this discussion, guys. The one we just did. I mean, you understand why we need to do that discussion, right? Because we're not just going to make up a whole set of things that will eventually show up and manipulate as well.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay, so like select pair. So it is the case for every one of these that there is a return value, right? So select pair, what does that return? I don't even know what that means. So that means you have a value and you've got a set of, is this animal, vegetable, mineral?
Exactly.
And it's got to
Right.
a whatever.
Right.
It's a weird name.
Hey, you figured that one out though. Last time it was called something else and you couldn't figure it out.
Oh, I couldn't figure it out from the name. I could figure it out from the categorize an item. Select pair, I absolutely could not figure out.
Okay.
That to me,
I don't think it's a common one anyway, but yeah, it's
right. I mean,
yeah.
to me, what that most brings to mind, I was just walking out a couple of days ago and I saw one of those people who deals with the, one of the, some phone repair person who had opened up a, one of those things that is full of pairs. You must have seen that, right? Maybe nobody knows what I'm talking about.
Be vague.
Twisted pairs of wires.
Oh, okay.
Right. It's a whole, that's what happens when I remember years and years ago, this is like 35 years ago. I remember actually in my house in Champagne, which was out in the sort of wilds of countryside. I was like, I need to get a faster, I was getting some faster internet connection or something there before it was even called an internet connection. And how did they actually do it? Well, the answer was that there were a bunch of these pairs of, these so-called pairs, which are just twisted pairs of wire, and there were like, 64 of them that all sort of arrived at some pole near the house. And basically somebody came out and they tested each pair and they figured out which one had the right insulation on it somewhere down the line to be able to transmit data at 64 kilobits per second or something instead of 16 kilobits per second. So it was purely a question of, well, let's hope that one of these 64 wires is good enough. So that's what select pair makes me think of.
I don't think most users are going to run into that.
Well,
confusion.
that's because they're too young.
The height of industry.
Okay. So, but seriously, what we need to do here. Okay. So
I think about shopping for socks.
Oh, that's a good one too. Yeah, none of these are what we actually. I mean, what is the type of thing that we're calling it? So, radio button bar is very much this is not what it does. This is what it looks like.
Right.
Right. So, in a sense, we have a different namespace here, which is what it does, as opposed to what it looks like. Right.
What you're asking the student to do.
Right. Or the survey fella or whatever it is.
Right.
Okay. So I like that distinction. I mean, that means that something. Okay. So let's understand what the choose multiple. What the heck is choose multiple versus multiple choice?
That's checkbox bar.
I know, but it's obviously horrifying. Okay. So let's just understand.
Right.
There are certain question types where there's a name for the question type. Multiple choice would actually be known as choose one.
Exactly.
Right?
But it's such a commonplace term. We just want to nail it on the head, right?
Yeah. Well, maybe we have an alternative there.
Yeah, that's fine. We can implement it both ways.
But I mean, okay. So Jolo on the live stream is suggesting select category, and I agree that would be a much better name than select pair.
Is
Are
that what
you-
it was last
Are
week?
you
That's what it was.
serious? That's what it was. That you were vehement, Stephen, not to call it that.
Well, I think we hadn't understood what the okay.
Well, it's because the example we gave you, the categories didn't really make sense as categories. I don't remember what it was like. Select the vice president accompanying the president or something, right?
Oh,
Also-
okay. So that's a
and that-
hopeless thing.
Right. So that they weren't really categories, but
Well,
it was
mapping,
still,
perhaps.
it was
Okay, so
matching
that's the
things
wrong
up.
thing. So I see. So select category is then wrong. So categorize an item isn't right. This is select what goes with what. Right? Goes
Right.
with.
It's like matching.
right.
Yes, that's right. Matching would be a good word.
Right. I think we avoided match because there are some of these where it might be pattern based. And the
Well,
exact thing.
okay, we need a language, so to speak. Okay, so
Right.
what we're describing here is what it is that you want. Okay, so here's how we should think about this. Think about the prompting text. Okay, for a survey, which says choose one of the following. Okay, that would be what you're calling multiple choice. Select any that apply.
Right.
So we have to think about what is the text
Okay.
that goes along with. So in this case of categorize an item, it's find the match, find matches or something. I don't know what the right exact term is, but I think that's kind of where we go. So all of these would have to be, like text completion. What the heck is that? Type set to fill in a blank.
Yep. That's type.
Okay.
Got
Okay.
it. Yeah.
So again, that's a noun, text completion. What we might be saying is that what this should be is a verb, right? So question interface, choose one here. Versus choose any for select any that apply, perhaps. So in other words, we could use in other words, is this a verb? And does that work for everything? Okay, how about a numeric range? So that would be choose value.
I think verbs is the way to go.
Wait, let's check these though.
And some of these.
Okay, so draw. Okay, so draw, what would that be?
That
Would
is a
that
verb
just be
already.
draw? It
Yeah,
is
I
a
think-
verb
I
already.
think draw
Good.
is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go down these for a second. Okay, click location. Yeah,
That's
all
a
right. I mean,
verb,
that's a verb already. So that first one we choose any because it isn't necessarily multiple.
Right.
Let's see, list multiple, enter multiple answer into input fields.
It's like a repeating element input field.
I understand. Well, so what's the thing for a generic for just an input field?
We called it short answer, but that's not a verb.
Right. Well, maybe enter text.
Enter text.
And then we've also got, in fact, Ethan on live stream comments on code, we could have enter code.
Right. And yeah, that's definitely
These are more intuitive.
one that we're going to have from the beginning, even though it's not on the list, I think. We've hooked up the code equivalent.
Okay, all right, fine.
Type.
All right.
So we could take another pass with this direction.
Right, but let's keep going here. I mean, sort, for example, it's okay. Yeah, it's okay. Determine whether a question is true or false. So that will be that will be a box.
Right.
That will simply be that's a
just a checkbox. Yeah.
a
True or
checkbox.
false. Yeah.
No, but we want a verb.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say?
Verify.
No. What you would say is you would simply ask the question: is the moon made of green cheese? Question mark. Checkbox. Is true.
It's not a verb.
Yeah, okay.
Determine truth.
Certified, confirm.
No, none of those are the right meaning. I mean, the right sense.
What about
It's just-
check? How about check?
No, because
It's kind of
check-
funny because it's a checkbox.
You were so
But, like,
energized with
I
that.
thought it was kind of clever on two ways because it's a checkbox. And
My question is, how many function names do we have that are puns? And the answer is we have a few, and I'm not sure how well they work out. In other words, where,
yeah.
I mean, block is the most famous pun, which I didn't even notice for years. Block is both the thing
Yeah.
that is a block of code and a thing that blocks the value of a variable.
Well, which one were you thinking of when you first put it in?
Block of code.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see. Answer true, false, answer.
Pick true, false.
Or just pick true. Right? Because you're not
Yeah.
picking the false ones. You're just picking the true ones.
Pick true isn't terrible. It's not great. Jolo asks on live stream, the second choice in select pair, which would be something like match items or something. Is it match items?
Sorry, for which one?
Select pair?
Yeah, match item. Right. You only do one.
I
It's
see.
like two action menus, left and right, and then you're matching one item from the left to one item on the right.
Right. The
Oh,
one
I
that
see.
we're calling pair right now is the one where it's multiple.
I see. I mean, it's almost like find matching item or find matching items.
Yeah.
Okay, in any case, these need to be verbs. Okay, so the question, the remaining thing before we wrap here is you had provided a candidate documentation thing.
Right. So this is the type of content that will go on the pages that each one of those interface types will have its own page. And this is the type of content that we'll put
okay.
there. So if you think there's anything blatantly missing from this, let us know
Well, I
before
think that
we
the thing we want
have
to
Brian
do,
make a template.
yeah, right. I think that the most obvious thing to do here, which would show up on guide pages as well, is at the top. I mean, it's got to be very, very obvious what the thing roughly looks like. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And possibly you just look down to the first example, but possibly we actually want, see, the problem with giving something at the top is that you have to actually pick content for it. And that's going to be difficult. So the only way we would put something at the top is if it was a stylized graphic design thing, where instead of red, green, blue, it would be just, gray bars for those things. Am I making sense? Just to
Yep.
give some indication of what the heck the thing is.
Yep. I understand.
And I think that would be useful for, to have for a guide page, the gray bar versions of each of those.
We want to be able to add these things without getting that design element optionally, though. Right. And have it come in later.
That's fine. But it may be that there's an easy enough way to do it that we simply take every piece of text and replace it with some gray bar. That may be all we're doing.
Okay.
Right. And then otherwise it's just whatever this thing comes out as.
The items on the agenda,
Right.
did you already look at those? On the right side, the right notebook.
It'll be harder when you're like
Just
clicking on a map. What's
CVS
the
folder
abstraction of a
label.
map look like?
The
Yes,
label
that's harder.
URI. Those look okay.
Say it again, where?
These items, CVS folder label URI.
Yes, that's
Okay.
fine. Yes, those are fine.
Alrighty.
What the heck is this thing?
We talked
Talk
about
about
this
that
a
a
couple
bit.
weeks ago. It's for like question pools or adaptive quizzes where it generates a question and is triggered based on a function.
Oh, right. And I do like the idea of seeing what we can get from the problem generator, which had a pretty elaborate UI. And how do challenges relate to this? So they're simpler. They just are.
Yeah. I mean, the good thing about challenges is that Rick's code equivalence is something that we can reuse here,
Yes,
which is
it's a big deal.
we've hooked up as a prototype, which is really going to be what a lot of people want.
Right. I mean, we'll need, as we know, we'll need math equivalents as well, which we have in the problem generator. We have, is you know what I'm saying? 3x
Yes.
is the same as whatever.
Yes.
And we know we need multiple levels of that because there's a level of math at which 3x is the same as x plus x plus x, and there's a level where it isn't.
Is
we've talked about that
Peg
before.
the guy to talk to?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
The people in he would be for very different kinds of questions. No,
Okay.
that's Wolfram Alpha math content people.
Okay.
Yeah, Brad
Brad
Bradley,
Jane.
who we already talked to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. For problem generator. Yeah.
Okay. Ethan is commenting, among the things we should have is annotate image, annotate audio, annotate video. It's a good point. So
yeah, got it. Okay.
because I suspect he's thinking about machine learning applications where essentially, okay, so let's just talk about that use case for 1 second.
Right.
Okay?
I mean, there's also the normal form notebook that doesn't have question objects, right? If you're not doing assessment, that's usually the way to go.
Yeah, I think if we're doing this thing with making setting work and stuff and being able to use it like that, then you would be doing it in form notebooks if you're trying to like label data and stuff like that.
Well, let's just understand that workflow for a second, okay? So you generate you're going to send it out to a bunch of curators. You've got lots of pictures and you're going to say, where are the tigers in these pictures or something? What's the workflow for that? And then you want to collect back the results of their curation.
Right. You could use a normal form notebook, and the action of submission would be add to a data bin, and you send it out, and then you watch your data bin fill out.
Okay, but so what is the thing that allows you to annotate the tigers?
Yeah,
question?
A form object or whatever in the form notebook, a cell.
But we don't have that control. I mean, what
it's just
you're saying,
input fields, right? You just put the image would be in the notebook, and you'd have an input field, right?
No. What you've just described is a third leg of this. Basically what you're saying is this is another thing. The case of a form object is another case where you can have an interface element. Right. Yeah. So just like dynamic is one of these cases where you should be able to use a question interface. So I suspect a form should be able to take a question interface. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep.
Just like we can say, so that's another thing we have to think through. So just like a form can take a control world thing, a dynamic control, so it should also be able to take a question interface.
Right. We thought about that at the beginning of this. That's
okay, fine. So then in that case, I just want to make sure we understand that to me is how that would work, right? Of how the the labeling data in a notebook would work, right? Let's check that we can do that use case, okay? With form notebooks and with this question interface mechanism. Because for example, the thing about pick a place on a map, or what Ethan is commenting on, we should have a built-in question interface that says annotate image, where you can either pick a point, the tiger is there, put your point on the nose, pin the tail on the donkey, whatever it is. Is that an American? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I never know with things like that, which kind of go back to, I don't think my kids were ever into the pin the tail.
I wouldn't have known if it was English. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, so, one thing is, pin the tail on a donkey at one point, and another is sort of give the bounding box of the donkey.
Right.
Okay, so both of those controls are of interest. And conceivably even annotate the picture with what kind of animal is in it, give its bounding box and give its name. I mean, those are all perfectly reasonable. I mean, not so much, well, it could perfectly well be. I mean, honestly, that's the type of thing I could imagine in some quiz. Actually, I would imagine that's a perfectly good elementary school activity. There's a picture of a zoo animals, multiple zoo animals, annotate the animals. But nobody would give that as a question right now because they do not have the technology to deal with it, if you understand what I'm saying. But we do. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, we just need to make the interface for it.
Right. So that's an argument for having richer interfaces like that.
And we need to make sure that they work in all the environments we want them to work in.
Exactly. Okay, there's a question about simplified drawing tool, put a circle, a square over each tiger. I think that gets into, I mean, that is an interesting, that's an interesting question. That one would be more like draw, but have a background image, which is a reasonable thing.
Oh yeah, that certainly would be in one of the options to draw. Background has been in the specs as an option for a bunch of these things.
Okay. Well, maybe then that's the way that you do the annotation of the tiger or the donkey or whatever it is you just put it as a background and then you're using the drawing mechanism.
Right.
Okay, there's a comment from BTC here. Semantic labels on individual pixels. Yeah, I mean, so that's another thing that's another complicated issue here, is you have sort of a paintbrush that is painting semantics onto pixels. That is, you paint over the donkey, and everything where your donkey paintbrush touches that pixel, it makes that pixel a donkey pixel. If that makes sense.
I understand what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah. It's just masking.
You lost me, but I wrote it down.
Donkey pixels, right? That's the key phrase.
The takeaway from the meeting today is donkey pixels.
Draw donkey pixels is the question.
Can I clarify something? All right. So this whole concept of making sure that all of our interfaces work in all the environments we want them to work in. So we have pin the tail on the donkey control type. Pin the tail on the donkey should work in question objects. We want them to work in regular form notebooks. Regular form notebooks use form objects. So if we want them to work in form objects, do we want pin on the tail on the donkey to also work in web forms?
Yes.
Okay, so then my question is, doesn't that go back to Bob's earlier point that pin the tail on the donkey has to be implemented as a generic control type, which you said we're not supposed to do because it puts more work on the front end?
No, because however question interface is implemented, right? Whatever it turns into in terms of boxes, that is what your responsibility is, to turn it into boxes. The front end team's responsibility is to render those boxes, right? So in other words, what we're doing is we're running, they've already implemented. So you might implement it using a text field or using a slider or something like that. They've already implemented the way that renders, and the cloud team has already implemented how that renders in the cloud. Am I making sense?
Well, web forms isn't in the cloud, it's HTML.
I know. That's a painful piece. And that's not clear how that would work. And maybe the way that works is that those forms that use these fancier pin the tail type controls have to be an embedded notebook.
Okay.
I think that's the right way to do it, because otherwise I think that's an infinite rabbit hole otherwise. Donkey hole, whatever it is. But
in terms of getting clarity, Bob, and Schroeder, does that make sense to you what Stephen just said?
Right. I mean, we're going to have things that work in form objects and notebooks, and
and then deploying that
work in a cloud deployed form.
What's that?
Making them work in a cloud deployed form is going to take a lot of work from somebody that's not in this meeting.
Sure.
Well, not necessarily a lot of work. It may just be the embedder. It may just be you have that fragment, notebook fragment. The only question is, how does the notebook fragment communicate its output to the enclosing HTML form?
I mean, and Bob's point is just that we don't own web forms, and I will make sure that gets
right. But I think Jan's
well, it's WPE. Oh, but yeah, it could handle it.
Yeah, Yarn's embedder, I believe, can return things because that's very similar to embedded HTML and embedded service and so on, which I believe can't have a mechanism for returning things. So I believe that has been solved. Okay, and we should leverage that mechanism.
Okay.
Okay, good stuff. And yeah, right. And the third, right. So it's forms, dynamic controls, and harvestable question interfaces are the three places, and each one has its own slightly different way of specifying interface. I mean, honestly, this is not horrifying. It just, we need to separate these. It's just like, functional programming versus procedural programming versus whatever else. You can do it in different ways depending on how you're thinking about what you're doing. And so in this case, what we need to emphasize here is the verb form of what you are trying to, what the prompt would be, as opposed to the dynamic interfaces, which is emphasizing what it looks like, as opposed to form objects, which are emphasizing what? They're emphasizing the data that is coming in, right? Those are the three cases, right? Mm-hmm. Question interface is emphasizing the prompt. Dynamic controls is emphasizing what it looks like, and forms is emphasizing what data comes in from it.
Yes.
Okay. So, and I think using that clarification is probably useful on guide pages and things to make people understand what these different approaches to interfaces are, even though they interoperate.
Okay. I'll make sure to share that with Brian Van Vertlu and everyone too.
Okay. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks to folks on the live stream too.